Welcome back to Nothing But the Truth. I'm Trudy Stern, and thank you for joining us for part two of our conversation with Eugene Kontorovich. Before October 7th, the dominant story coming out of Israel was not war or terror. It was judicial reform. The country was gripped by an internal battle, one that spilled into the streets with mass protests, political deadlock, and a deeply divided public. It was a moment of intense national focus, and as many now believe, a dangerous distraction from the existential threats gathering at Israel's borders. And even now, as Israel faces grave external challenges, judicial reform continues to be a polarizing and unresolved issue, contributing to internal divisions and raising serious concerns about the future of the country's democratic institutions. Today, we're taking a closer look at that fight over judicial reform, what's really at stake, how does the Israeli judicial system work, and how is it different from ours here in the United States? And why did this issue ignite such a firestorm? To help us break it all down, we're continuing our conversation with Eugene Kontorovich. Just to remind my listeners, Eugene Kontorovich is one of the most important legal minds defending Israel on the world stage. He's Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Senior Scholar at the Kohelet Policy Forum, and a professor at George Mason University Scalia Law School. He's a leading force in exposing the hypocrisy of international institutions. Few people understand this legal battlefield better, and few are fighting harder for Israel in the courtroom and beyond. I'm so thrilled to welcome you back, Eugene, and to have you here. Let's dive right into one of the most complex issues, Israel's judicial reform.
Thank you so much.
Before we continue the discussion, I want to wish you a very big mazel tov. I understand you just had a baby and added to your family.
Indeed, my first son, so I'm very excited.
Oh, wow, that is very exciting. May he always bring you much happiness and joy. Okay, so if you can start at the beginning and explain what Israel's judicial reform debate is all about and why it's such a divisive issue.
Okay, so first of all, why it's part of it is not divisive. I think most politicians in Israel, representing most parties, agree that the Supreme Court and the bureaucracy has too much power. The only question is what changes to make and who should make those changes. That's a big part of it.
Well, could we start at the very beginning, though, even before that? What is the judicial system that is being criticized here, or why is there a need for this?
So the Supreme Court in Israel has power unlike any court in the world, right? Right now, President Trump is criticizing the courts as being too powerful. Before that, Biden was criticizing the courts in America as being too powerful. They don't hold a candle to the power that the Israeli Supreme Court has. I would say that the Supreme Court is more like the actual government of the country, the Supreme Court and the legal advisors.
Can you explain that?
Yeah, I'm going to explain it all. Okay, so it takes a minute. And it's not just about the Supreme Court. A big part of it is about the role of the government legal advisors, which is the Attorney General and other legal officials in the government. So let me explain all this. Unlike in America, Israel does not have a written constitution. And for a very long time, the Supreme Court said that means that it works like England, which has a system of parliamentary sovereignty. Right? The parliament is sovereign, and the court just is supposed to interpret what the parliament passes. In the 90s, a law was passed called Basic Law Human Dignity. And in Israel, there are a set of laws called basic laws, which are constitutional in the sense that they deal with the topics typically dealt with in constitutions. How many seats are there in the Knesset? How you pick the prime minister, the basic structure of government, um, as well as individual rights to some extent. But they're not constitutional in the sense that they were not made through a special constitutional process, right? That is to say, they were not adopted by a supermajority. They were not done through a special, they were just adopted as ordinary legislation. So the Supreme Court started saying that it could strike down laws if they conflicted with basic laws. That was already a new innovation. But then it went even further. And it said also there's a basic idea that every government decision, if they are just, every government decision has to be reasonable. Now, reasonable does not mean like in America, when a court reviews action, an agency, a government action for reasonableness, it means they're asking the question, could a person who is not like deranged have come to this decision, right? And if it's a decision that a not deranged person could have reached, it's okay, even if it's deeply problematic. When the Israeli Supreme Court says the government can only act reasonably, they really mean, would we have done this if we were in their shoes? And the way they say, did they properly balance the different interests? There's always two competing interests, safety versus security, whatever. Did they properly balance them? And did they think about it enough? The Supreme Court has laws they don't like. They have even struck down, saying the government did not spend enough time thinking about it. In other words, they can strike down legislation for really any reason, but it's not just legislation. It goes
Have they,
even,
have they done that?
yes, but it goes much further. Again, there's like a talking point. They say that they've only struck down, I don't know, a few dozen laws, but because much of the time they don't strike it down, what they say is it can't be enforced the way it's written. They rewrite it to say what they want it to say, and then it's not. They don't call that striking down. They just rewrite it. The they This also applies to all government appointments. The prime minister cannot pick whoever he wants to be a cabinet minister, to be a general. He can only pick people who it's reasonable to pick. Now, it's not reasonable if the court considers them unqualified. If the court has blocked government action, saying you're not doing it for the right reasons, you're doing it for political reasons. Of course, politicians do everything for political reasons. They have blocked appointments of political people who the prime minister would trust politically, saying they're not really an expert, meaning they have not proven themselves as professional deep state members for 20 years to ensure that they're going to make the same decisions the court would want them to make. As a result, the prime minister doesn't run the government. When we say, go back to America, it says in the American Constitution, the president is the chief executive, right? There's like millions of people working for the federal government. How can we say he's like in charge of them? And the answer that constitutional law gives is obviously he's not hiring everyone, right? And he's not controlling everyone's actions. He controls the cabinet. The cabinet then controls the under cabinet down to, and that is done by the ability to fire and pick them. As it stands now, the prime minister cannot pick his cabinet without the Supreme Court having to okay it.
Well,
Uh,
wait, I just have a quick question on that. In our country, you need advice and consent of Congress. So
yeah. So for cabinet appointments, so Israel does not have that system. Israel has a parliamentary system, and in parliamentary system, the prime minister forms his own cabinet. Because again, typically cabinet members are picked for political, they're the heads of other parties. That's the way it works in a parliamentary system. But again, but I think right now it's a good time to address a talking point that some people might hear. They'll say, well, Israel needs many, many more safeguards because Israel only has one house of parliament. Okay, but Israel has other safeguards. Israel has other safeguards, in particular, an electoral system that makes it essentially impossible for any party to get a majority of seats. Right? In Britain, when you're the prime minister, you usually have a majority of seats or very close to a majority of seats. In Canada, prime minister has close to a majority or a majority of seats. In Israel, the prime minister typically does not even have, is lucky to have half of a majority. We just had our former prime minister had 6 out of 120 seats in the Knesset. What does that mean? That means that those officials are, those prime minister is already weak, right? Israeli governments are very fragile because they depend on lots of other parties to support them. So an Israeli prime minister with 6 seats is not like an American president who has a guaranteed 4-year term and can do whatever he wants. More important, and indeed, the average shelf life of an Israeli government is about 2.5 years, which shows that there is a built-in check, right? It's not the check of two houses. It's not the check of federalism. It's the check of needing 10 parties just to cooperate, just to maintain a parliamentary majority. But that's a very strong check. But in any case, right now, when you have in America a president whose party controls two houses of Congress, right? Then Congress is not really a check in the same way, right? Because typically the framers thought that Congress and the president would work against each other no matter what but when Congress and the president are in the hands of the same party, they don't work again, they work together. And that is the case in America, something I believe like 30% of the time. But we don't have a special constitutional rules saying, oh, when the president and the Congress are of the same party, then the Supreme Court can, invalidate cabinet appointments. So right now in Israel, the attorney general was not picked by the prime minister. The head of the secret police, the head of the FBI, was not picked by the prime minister. And until recently, the chief of staff was not picked by the prime minister. Now the prime minister wants to fire the attorney general, who's constantly trying to put him in jail, and also the head of the secret police, who's also trying to put him in jail. And the Supreme Court says you're not allowed to fire them. And the prime minister says, "But wait, I lost my trust in the head of the secret police because of a list of various bad things he did." Here's what the Supreme Court said: yes, there may be legal reasons to fire him, but that's not what's in your head. You're doing it for bad reasons.
So the Supreme Court here has a lot of power. So
but it gets even. We're not even done. This is a small part of the power. Unlike in America, so in America also you need to start at a district court and you need to have a dispute. In Israel, any lawsuit against government action goes straight to the Supreme Court. No stand. Anyone can simply say, I think what the government is doing wrong. The Ukrainian ambassador was allowed to bring a lawsuit challenging Israel's visa quota for Ukrainian refugees. And the Supreme Court said, that's correct, it's too low. It's unreasonably low. Really, we could take more. Obviously, in America, no part of that case could work. There is no so basically every left-wing political organization simply files a lawsuit saying we don't like what the government what the government's doing. Now, but then and it can go straight to the Supreme Court, which decides the case without any evidence and without any proceedings in lower courts, just on like the papers.
The Supreme Court also decides what cases it wants to hear, correct?
Well, it gets 12,000, 15,000. It hears 12,000 petitions a year. It's not going to act on all of those, right? So everyone is writing in, and then it can pick. So this gives it vast power. But wait, so let's say you have a left-wing group says, I think what the government's doing is illegal. So then who's going to represent the government in court?
The Attorney General, who is appointed by the Supreme Court.
Not by the in part by the Supreme Court. But the Attorney General is not working for the government. And there are many times when the Attorney General says, you know what? I also think what the government's doing is illegal. I'm going to go in and I'm going to argue against the government. And the government then says, you know what? Maybe we should be represented. So how about we bring a different lawyer?
Okay, so there are clear problems here.
Not allowed to. Now, the judges themselves on the Supreme Court are picked by a committee, which consists not exclusively of judges, but in which judges basically have a veto. So it works, and I'm a professor. I've seen this up close. It works much like faculty hiring. In the end, you create an institution which looks more and more like a caricature of itself. It gets like ideologically more and more pure as time goes on. Right? You're not gonna hire someone who thinks you're full of it. And people talk about there's no real conservative judges on the court in the sense of in America the conservative judges and the liberal judges have fundamental disagreements about the role of the courts, judicial power, etc. In Israel, there's no fundamental disagreement. They
So
all, yeah,
when you say ideologically pure, it sounds like a good thing, but no, you don't mean it in a good way. You mean ideologically pure to the viewpoint of the people that are
the original, the
that
homogeneous,
yes. So
homogeneous. So
exactly,
there is, you'll see all, it's not in America, the court is narrowly divided on major issues. In Israel, they're narrowly divided on no major issues, and that should be alarming, given that the Israeli public is divided on these issues. So you have a court that really does not reflect the public at all, and that is in charge of everything. But we haven't even touched on the real problem yet:
which is
the legal advisors. By hearing 12,000 petitions a year, the Supreme Court cannot control all aspects of life in Israel because there's more than 12,000 decisions that the government makes. Um, Government makes, hundreds of thousands of decisions. So in Israel, every single government agency, down to like from a cabinet ministry to the village council, has a legal advisor. That would be like the general counsel of a cabinet ministry of a cabinet office in America. Now, in America, who's going to be the general counsel? Someone who the secretary picks. Right? One of my friends just went to be a general counsel in one of the cabinet offices. Um, in Israel, they're all career civil servants. They're all part of the same pool of government lawyers. And the Supreme Court, I told you the Supreme Court said you're not allowed to do anything that's not reasonable, right?
right.
One thing that's not reasonable, they decided, is not to listen to the advice of your legal advisor. In other words, they have created a situation where the legal advisors have veto power over government decisions. Now, you say, oh, but they must have a reason if they're saying, no, they don't even need a reason. They can literally write a one sentence memo, and I've seen these. I believe that the government's course of action is problematic legally. That's it. It's over. Or I believe the Supreme Court, even better, I believe the Supreme Court might find it unconstitutional. In other words, the government can't do anything. It can't get its own lawyers, and it has its hands tied behind its back. So, from a national security perspective, this is no way to. You were talking about, Israel surrounded by enemies. When you're surrounded by enemies, you can't have really two governments trying to function in one.
I see.
And what's worse about this is, look, the government of the Supreme Court is not the worst government. They do some things right. But what's terrible about them is that they have vast power, but little visibility and no accountability. That is to say, they tie the hands of the government, but when something's not going right in the country, people don't say, oh, it's the fault of the Supreme Court who's not letting the prime minister pick the people he wants. They say it's the fault of the prime minister.
So who would be in favor of this system other than the judges themselves?
The judges themselves, but also the people who lose elections. Because if you're in a party that regularly loses elections, your only hope of having politics come out the way you want it is through an unelected body. And the reason this is such a big fight is because the right-wing parties have been winning elections overwhelmingly now for decades. So the Supreme Court is the last hope of those who can't win elections. But also it's broader than that. The I mean, in two words, let's say the deep state, because the court is kind of like the government of the deep state. They're the top institution of the deep state. And the people who they allow to have offices, who they like to promote, are very grateful to them.
So I actually was with Ambassador Tom Nides the year before 10/7 occurred. And we were on March of the Living together in Poland. And he actually said to me something a little bit different than what you're saying. He said that in his role as ambassador, a lot of members of Congress are seeing these judicial reforms. That was really the peak of all of these protests. Every Saturday night, you would see these protests happening, and there was a lot of strife within the Israeli community. And he said that these members of Congress came and they were extremely critical of what was going on in Israel, and he said they were making a very big issue of it, but that these protests were peaceful, and that you just don't generally see peaceful protests when you have these very strong issues being debated amongst the population. So he was actually saying it in a good way, and about about Israel being a democracy just like us in America, and that this was healthy debate and this was a good thing. However, it wasn't being perceived that way. So
Perception is really everything. For example, people perceive Israel as being a democracy, despite the fact that the Supreme Court really makes it function in significant part as a kind of judicial aristocracy.
well, this is you really laid it out in a way that's very understandable, and it's an issue that seems to be extremely complex. Do you see the reforms actually happening? The issue is becoming but like there is a lot going on with this now.
So since the sort of judicial reform movement of 2 years ago, which basically failed, two things have happened. First of all, the Supreme Court has seized even more power than when the reform, right? Now, before the reform movement was saying the Supreme Court has wielding power by claiming it can interpret basic laws. Now, so they passed a basic law saying the Supreme Court could not strike down laws just for being unreasonable, right? Just because they disagree with them. And this was passed as a basic law. The Supreme Court had until recently said basic laws are constitutional, and there's nothing higher than basic laws. When they passed this basic law, that was the first basic law the Supreme Court didn't like, they said, you know what? That basic law is not part of the Constitution because there's a higher Constitution. You might not have seen it, but they have. There's a higher Constitution, which we know, which decides which basic laws can be part of the Constitution and which aren't. So now they've actually not only said that they can interpret the Constitution, but that they can decide what's in it. So they've seized absolute power. At the same time, during the war, the judicial authorities have taken several moves which I think were really publicly seen as being, let's say, excessively lenient on Hamas, uh, not being able to target non-Hamas members that invaded Israel on October 7th. There's conditions of confinement about Hamas prisoners, which I think there's really now even a more broadly perceived need for some kind of reform.
Well, you've really laid out, all of or some of the issues that
Obviously.
are regarding this judicial reform, and I certainly hope that these issues can be resolved in a good way. It always is the major problems for the Jews throughout our history is when they fight within each other, against each other. So let's hope that there can be a good resolution and a peaceful one, and one that makes sense. For all of us who are watching from abroad, I think we owe it to Israel to allow their democracy to work. This is a sign of a healthy democracy to be able to debate peacefully. Societies evolve, democracies adjust to reflect the will of the people, and this process should be respected and not condemned, particularly by those of us not living in Israel at all. So we should be supportive of this process and not undermine them, in all of our discussions with others. Eugene, you have been incredible. Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much. You really made this very complex topic more understandable, more reachable to those of us listening to you. And it is remarkable, your breadth of knowledge on so many different topics relating to the law. So I want to really thank you so much for helping us to understand.
It's
And
been really good.
I do hope that you'll come back again. We will need part 3, 4, 5, and 6 to really get to more issues. So your expertise really helped us navigate complex and consequential issues, and your insights bring such clarity to topics that continue to shape the future of Israel. So thank you. To our listeners, remember, you can catch Nothing But the Truth every Thursday night at 9:30 on the radio. If you missed any part of this episode or want to hear any of our past shows, you can find Nothing But the Truth wherever you get podcasts. To our listeners, thank you for joining us. This has been Nothing But the Truth with Trudy Stern. Until next time, stay strong, stay informed, and keep seeking nothing but the truth.